Okay, so today we're taking a deep dive into India's National Education Policy 2020, the NDP 2020.
Oh, right.
Based on this really in-depth document you sent over.
Okay.
It's full of analysis and data about the current state of education there, and we're going to unpack it for you.
Yeah.
We want to pull out the key shifts that this policy is aiming for, the big goals.
Right.
Consider this like a shortcut to understanding what's at the core of the NDP 2020.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. You've given us a very comprehensive overview of this really complex policy, and our mission here is to distill the most important insights so you can come away with a clear understanding of what the NEP 2020 is really trying to do and the challenges it's taking on.
Right. So, like, right off the bat, the first thing that grabs you about this policy is the sheer ambition of it, right?
Yeah, huge.
It's not just tweaking things here and there. It's talking about a fundamental redesign of how education works in India.
Exactly. It's a complete overhaul from early childhood education all the way up through higher learning. It's really impressive. They're trying to take a holistic approach to shaping the future of education in the country.
And a cornerstone of this transformation is increasing access to education at all levels, right?
Absolutely. Universal access is key. And if you look at higher education specifically, the policy sets this ambitious target for the gross enrollment ratio, the GER.
Okay.
And just to clarify, GER is the percentage of the eligible age group that's actually enrolled in higher education.
Okay.
So they want to hit a GER of 50% by the year 2035.
2035.
That's the goal.
So to really grasp like how ambitious that is, you have to look at where things stand right now.
Right.
You gave us some data. The GER in higher education was only 26.3% back in 2018-19.
Yeah.
So they're talking about essentially doubling the number of students in higher ed in about a decade and a half.
It's a huge undertaking.
That's massive.
And for some international context to show the scale of the gap they're trying to close,
Okay.
in 2017-18 countries like Brazil and China, their GERs were around 50%. Indonesia was at 36%. Even South Africa was at 22%.
Okay.
And then you look at developed countries like Germany, France, the UK, those are way higher, 60, 70%.
Right.
So you can see the significant ground India is trying to cover here.
Yeah, and it's not just about like cramming more students into the existing system, right?
No, exactly.
It's not just about numbers.
It means a massive need for new infrastructure, qualified faculty,
Yeah.
and potentially like different models of higher education to accommodate all these new students.
Totally. And that raises a whole other set of questions, right?
Absolutely.
About maintaining quality during such a rapid expansion.
Right. How do you ensure equitable access for everyone while you're scaling up so quickly?
It's a huge challenge.
It is.
And, this document, Ocean points out this interesting thing, like getting kids into primary school seems to be going pretty well.
Yeah.
But keeping them in the system as they get older, that seems to be the big hurdle.
That's a critical point. The Right to Education Act has been very successful in getting almost all kids enrolled in elementary education.
Right.
But the data shows a big drop-off as students move through the system. By 2015-16, the GER at the senior secondary level was only 56.2%.
Wow.
Compared to 99.2% at the primary level.
That's a huge difference.
So the challenge isn't just about getting kids in the door. It's about keeping them engaged, making sure they finish their education.
Right. And it seems like this issue of students dropping out isn't affecting everyone equally, right?
Sadly, no.
Like it's hitting some groups much harder than others.
Exactly. The document highlights how the decline in GER is more pronounced for socioeconomically disadvantaged groups.
So that's
disparities based on gender,
social
identity, specifically scheduled castes and scheduled tribes,
Okay.
socioeconomic conditions, and disabilities.
Wow. So it's like this overall picture of dropouts is already concerning.
Yes.
But then it becomes even more so when you see how it disproportionately affects specific communities.
Right.
And the data really lays that out there, right?
It does.
Looking at those 2015-16 figures, the overall GER at the senior secondary level was 56.2%, but for scheduled castes, it was 56.8%.
Yeah.
And for scheduled tribes, it was much lower, only 43.1%.
It's a big difference.
And there's also the gender aspect.
Right.
The female GER was 56.4% compared to 56% for males.
Interesting.
So it's not just a simple story. There are all these layers to it.
And it's really important to understand the reasons behind these dropouts, right?
Right, like why are these kids leaving school?
Exactly. The document provides some insights based on a 2015-16 survey.
Okay.
And for both male and female students, lack of interest in studies is a major factor.
Okay.
And then financial constraints are a big hurdle for both groups, too.
Obvious.
But when you look at the specific reasons, it gets even more interesting for boys engaging in our economic activities is a big factor.
Okay.
31% of boys who dropped out cited that as a reason.
So they're having to work.
Right. And for girls, while financial constraints and lack of interest are definitely there, a striking 29.7% dropped out because they were engaged in domestic activities.
Oh, wow.
And sadly, 13.9% because of marriage.
That's really sad.
Yeah, it shows you how different societal pressures can really interrupt a young person's education.
It's heartbreaking to see those numbers on girls dropping out due to marriage.
It is.
Like, it highlights those deep-seated societal barriers that education policies need to actively fight against.
Absolutely, and the policy acknowledges these complex reasons.
Okay, good.
They recommend strengthening existing schemes that are aimed at supporting disadvantaged students.
Right.
And they propose creating these special education zones.
Okay.
And gender inclusion funds to try to tackle these equity challenges head on.
Okay, so another big area the NEP 2020 highlights is foundational literacy and numeracy,
Yes.
right? And it seems like there's a real concern about the learning levels that kids are actually achieving at the elementary stage.
There is, and the National Achievement Survey from 2017 really paints a concerning picture.
Like, what are we talking about here?
Well, it suggests that a significant portion of students who are completing elementary education haven't actually learned basic literacy and numeracy skills
By the time they finish elementary school.
by the time they reach grade 3.
Oh, wow, so early on.
Yeah.
So what kind of numbers are we looking at?
Okay, so only 57% of grade 3 students could solve basic numeracy problems.
Basic numeracy? Like, what are we talking about?
Like adding and subtracting.
Wow.
That's pretty basic stuff.
And that means a big chunk of kids are starting their education without those really essential skills.
Right, and it's not just numeracy either. The NAES 2017 also looked at language skills.
Okay.
68% could read small text with comprehension, and 65% could read printed scripts, like on a classroom walls.
Okay.
But those numbers still mean there's a lot of kids struggling with basic reading.
Yeah, and when it came to math, like applying those operations, analyzing a problem, and figuring out if you need to add or subtract,
Right.
only 59% of grade 3 students could do that.
Yeah, it's a problem.
So how does the EP 2020 propose to fix this?
Okay, so they're proposing a national mission on foundational literacy and numeracy.
Okay, a whole mission.
It's a big deal. The goal is to make sure that every single child achieves those basic skills in primary school by 2025.
Okay, that's a big goal.
It is, and a key part of this is making high-quality learning resources available on the government's e-learning platform, Diksha.
Diksha. Okay, so they're trying to leverage technology to
Exactly.
get those resources out there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit now and talk about the operational side of the system,
Okay.
like school governance and the resources that schools actually have.
All right.
The document brings up some really interesting challenges related to the size of schools and their infrastructure.
Right. So one thing that really stood out is the data on school enrollment back in 2016. Over 55% of primary schools in India had less than 60 students.
Less than 60 students, that's tiny.
It is. And, ensuring access to schooling in remote areas is important.
Yeah.
But having so many small schools creates real challenges.
Like what kind of challenges?
Well, it's hard to deploy teachers effectively.
Oh, yeah.
And it's hard to provide enough resources when you have so many tiny schools.
Right, like spreading those resources so thin.
Exactly.
And the data really shows this, right?
It does. A huge chunk of primary schools fall into that under 60 student category.
Okay.
And as you move up to upper primary and higher secondary, you see bigger enrollments.
Mm-hmm.
But that base level has a ton of very small schools.
And this issue of small school size is often connected to the problem of infrastructure, too, right?
Absolutely.
Like if you have a tiny school, it's harder to justify having a library or a lab or whatever.
Right. The document has this data on the availability of basic facilities in schools back in 2016-17.
Okay.
And the disparities across different levels are really striking.
Like what do you mean?
Well, a decent percentage of higher and senior secondary schools have libraries, librarians, playgrounds, functional computers, internet access.
Okay.
But those numbers are much lower for primary and upper primary schools.
So the younger kids are getting the short end of the stick.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Wow. So, like, for example, what percentage of primary schools had computers or internet access?
A very small percentage. It's really concerning.
So how does the ME 2020 plan to tackle these issues?
Well, they introduced this concept of school complexes.
School complexes. Okay, what's that?
So basically, you group neighboring schools together into clusters
Okay,
so they can share resources.
I see. So like if one school can't afford a science lab on its own,
Right.
maybe the whole complex can share one.
Exactly.
That's a clever idea.
It is, especially in rural areas where you might have several small schools close together.
Yeah.
It also aims to improve governance by creating a more unified structure at the cluster level.
Okay, so they're trying to create these more efficient and better resourced units?
Right.
Okay, so let's move up to higher education.
All right.
Your document points to a really fragmented higher ed ecosystem in India.
Yeah, it's pretty diverse and sometimes confusing. You have all these different types of institutions, deemed universities, affiliating colleges, autonomous institutions.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is, and the MP wants to simplify things by having a more unified designation, just university.
So get rid of all those confusing categories.
Exactly.
Just call them all universities.
With distinctions based on their focus.
Okay, I see.
Like what they primarily do.
And when you look at the numbers, the sheer number of higher ed institutions in India is amazing.
Yeah, just in 2018-19, there were almost 1,000 institutions across all those different categories. Central universities, state universities, deemed to be universities, private universities, all sorts of colleges.
It's a lot for a student to navigate.
It is.
So what are they proposing exactly?
Okay, so beyond just simplifying the names, the MP wants to categorize HI's higher education institutions into 3 distinct types.
Okay, 3 types. What are they?
So you have research-intensive universities, teaching-intensive universities, and degree-granting colleges.
Okay, so each one has a clear focus.
Right.
Like if you're really into research, you go to a research-intensive university.
Exactly.
If you're more focused on teaching.
You go to a teaching-intensive university.
And if you just want to get your degree.
You go to a degree-granting college.
Makes sense.
It's about creating clear pathways for students.
So another crucial aspect of higher education, and really for a country's progress as a whole, is research and development, right?
Absolutely.
And your document highlights this worrying statistic about India's investment in R&D.
Yeah, it's pretty low compared to other countries.
So, like, what are we talking about here?
So right now, India spends about 0.69% of its GDP on R&D.
Okay.
But when you compare that to other countries, back in 2017, countries like South Korea and Israel were investing over 4% of their GDP in R&D.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is. Japan was around 3%, the U.S. over 2.5%. Even China was way ahead of India.
So India's really lagging behind.
Yeah, and if you look at India's R&D expenditure over the past few years, it's been pretty stagnant as a percentage of GDP.
Okay.
Even though the absolute amount of money spent has gone up a bit.
So there's clearly a need for a big boost in this area.
Absolutely, and the NEP 2020 addresses this directly by proposing a National Research Foundation, the NRF.
Okay, so another big initiative.
Yeah, this is a big deal. The NRF is supposed to provide funding and support for high-quality research across all disciplines.
So they're trying to build a stronger research culture in the country.
Exactly.
All right, so let's talk a bit about digital education.
Okay.
You know, recent events have really shown how important and how challenging remote learning can be.
Right.
So what does the NEP 2020 have to say about digital education?
Well, they recognize the potential of digital learning.
Okay.
They see it as a way to offer different high-quality ways to learn.
Mm-hmm.
But they also emphasize that digital education has to be inclusive.
Right. You can't just benefit the people who already have access to technology.
Exactly.
And the data you provided on access to computers and the internet shows just how big the digital divide is in India.
Yeah.
Looking at the 2017-18 figures, there's a huge gap between rural and urban households.
Right.
Only a tiny percentage of rural households had computers or internet.
Compared to urban areas where it's much higher.
And that same gap exists when you look at the ability of kids aged 5 to 14 to use these technologies.
Exactly.
So this digital divide is a big obstacle that needs to be addressed if digital education is going to work for everyone.
Right, and the EP 2020 stresses that they
Okay, so-
say we need to bridge this gap.
Okay, so finally, let's talk money.
All right.
Because you can have the best policy in the world,
Mm-hmm.
but if you don't fund it, it's not going to happen.
Right, money matters.
So the EP 2020 talks about increasing public spending on education.
It does. There's this long-standing recommendation to increase spending to 6% of India's GDP.
6%, okay.
And the EPC reaffirms that as a national goal.
So are they hitting that target?
Not yet. Back in 2017-18, the budgeted spending on education was only 4.43% of GDP.
Okay.
So they're getting closer.
Mm-hmm.
There has been a gradual increase over the past few years,
Okay.
but it's still short of that 6% goal.
And how does that compare to other countries?
If you look back at 2015,
Okay.
countries like Brazil, Germany, South Africa, the UK, they were all spending a higher percentage of their GDP on education than India was.
Wow.
So it really puts India's current investment in context.
Right. And your document also mentions how different states within India allocate different amounts to education.
Yes, it's another layer of complexity.
It's like this whole theme that runs through the policy.
What's that?
The need for more resources.
Yes.
Like they're outlining all these ambitious goals,
Mm-hmm.
but they're also acknowledging that it's going to take a huge investment to make them a reality.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are like the big takeaways for you from this analysis of the NEP 2020?
For me, the scale of the ambition is just mind-blowing. You know, their goal of universal access, that 50% GER target for higher ed by 2035.
It's huge.
It's massive. And the data you provided shows just how far they have to go to get there.
Yeah.
And I was really struck by their focus on tackling the dropout issue.
Yeah.
They really get into the socioeconomic factors that are driving kids to leave school.
That's important.
And that emphasis on foundational literacy and numeracy,
Yes,
that data from the National Achievement Survey is a wake-up call.
it is.
We have to make sure kids are learning those basic skills early on.
Right.
And then the restructuring of higher education, the push for more research and development, it's all really ambitious.
Yeah, and those comparisons of India's GER and R&D spending to other countries,
Yeah.
those were really eye-opening for me.
They put things in perspective.
And those disparities in dropout rates and access to resources,
Right.
it really highlights the equity challenges that the MP is trying to address.
It does.
So yeah, definitely some aha moments for me in this deep dive.
I think we both learned a lot.
And hopefully our listener did too.
Yeah, you came to us wanting to understand the NEP 2020 quickly and thoroughly
Right.
without getting bogged down in all the details. And I think our conversation has given you a good overview of the key points.
It has, and it's all based on the information you sent us.
Exactly.
So listener, here's something to think about.
Okay.
We've talked about all these ambitious goals and the challenges facing the Indian education system.
Yeah.
So which of these proposed changes do you think has the biggest potential to really transform education in India?
That's a good question.
And thinking about how important technology is these days, what role do you see it playing in achieving these goals?
Right. Will it be a help or a hindrance?
Or maybe a bit of both.
Could be.
It's a complex issue,
It is.
but it's an important one.
Absolutely.
So thanks for taking this deep dive with us, listener.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.